Welcome to Conversations with Ryland Fisher. And today we talk to Ebrahim Rasool, former Premier of the Western Cape and former South African Ambassador to the United States. Welcome, Ebrahim, or should I say Your Excellency?
No. Thanks very much for the welcome. You are only the Excellency when you actually represent the President. Fortunately, you keep the Ambassador title, unlike the Premier title, which you give up. So you can call me the former Ambassador, and the title remains. But thanks very much for the welcome.
Thank you. And also belated happy birthday for Friday, by the way. I hope you had a great celebration.
Well, great celebrations in our community is great food, and we've had all of that. I'm amazed at how you can outsource even a bride today. And that's what I've done with Tyler Bride. So you can get things where you're not sweating behind the pots.
Okay, thank you. But so it's been a while since you've been Premier of the Western Cape. I think it was 2008.
Yeah.
And for those who don't know, I mean, can you maybe just take us very briefly through what you've been doing since you left, can I say, like the local headlines, you know?
Look, the headline was, if I do it in curriculum vitae style, I moved from the Premier's office to advisor to Kgalema Motlanthe, who then became State President for that intervening period. I then became a Member of Parliament, and then I was deployed to Washington as South Africa's ambassador. And it was, of sorts, a wonderful exile from both the troubles of the Western Cape and the troubles of the ANC. And just when you think you're at your worst, you see that there's a broader life. And I've thoroughly enjoyed my now 6 years in Washington, 4.5 of it as South Africa's ambassador. And those were great years to be in Washington, coinciding with President Obama's presidency. And the last 1.5 years have been as what is called a scholar in residence at Georgetown University, the School for Foreign Service, and more particularly the Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. And the last 1.5 years have just been about writing, researching, lecturing, and traveling the world, particularly to the troubled spots of the world.
There was some talk that this came about because of your personal relationship with Barack Obama. How much truth is in it?
Look, the person who appoints you as ambassador is your own president.
Yeah.
And so it was President Zuma. But what influenced it was the fact that in 2005, I addressed a gathering in Chicago. The next morning, I was invited for breakfast with the first Muslim congressman, Congressman Keith Ellison. And he said to me, he has a friend who thinks like I do, and he'd like us to meet. I came back to South Africa from that plane after an enormous delay because of what I believe I was profiled. As a Muslim, I missed 3 flights because they insisted on searching me and everything. And I promised not to go back to the US until George Bush was no longer president. Then 2006, this unknown senator from Illinois comes to South Africa, and he wants to meet the president and the deputy president and the minister of this and the minister of that, and no one knows him, so no one wants to meet him. But because his name had been mentioned to him, I sit with him, and he's now got a clear program. I sit with him in the Premier's office with some of my MECs. We sit there for about 2.5 hours, and I give him as a gift a lithograph of Nelson Mandela's first speech on the day he was released. And 2 years later, the unknown senator from Illinois is elected as the President of the United States. And just shortly after that, I get a call from President Zuma to come to his house. And he says to me, listen, I think we messed up, but from the newspapers, you seem to be one of the few people who actually met Obama while he was in South Africa. Can you go to Washington? And that's how I ended up in Washington. It was great because as we were sitting very relaxed in our informal outfits on the aeroplane as it landed at Dallas International Airport, the pilot says, can Ambassador Rasool and his family please come to the front? And there's this whole big protocol service to take us off the plane and to say, listen, normally ambassadors wait 3 months before they go to the Oval Office to hand in their credentials. President Obama is very aware that it's Ramadan in 10 days' time. So one day before Ramadan, you will be in the Oval Office to present your credentials. And that was a record time. 9 days later, I was in the Oval Office meeting him, chatting away, and so forth. And so it's been good, but I think it's also been full of lessons.
Mm. And so have you interacted with him quite a bit in the last 5 years or so?
Yeah, we've seen each other at both formal occasions and informally. I think that I was very happy to help advise that he should, for example, on his visit to South Africa, make a detour down to Cape Town and recreate the Robert Kennedy visit to UCT and so forth. Unfortunately, tomorrow night I will miss the Eid celebrations in the White House because I'm happily here, and so we've been chatting on and off, but not. I would have been very reluctant to play the role of even an informal advisor to him, simply because of the complications of the US politics. The one thing you learn there is that the United States has a way of talking up its president, the commander-in-chief, ruler of the free world, etc. But one person does not shift the tanker, that is the USA. And for you to pretend that you can say something to the president that will shift the tanker is an exercise in folly. And I think that even if President Obama were to think back over his term as president of the USA, he should have not only a set of regrets about what he could have done, but he would be having the limitations of his powers. Because if a Congress hates you because you're black, you're not going to get anything done. If you can't manage the executive authority over how blacks are treated, or even issue a simple, self-evident issue of gun violence, then what is your presidency about? And so the point that I'm making is that it has been good to know the president, but it has also been good not to pretend that you can influence him in anything but a kind of attitudinal way.
So do you think there's maybe some similarities between the ANC's, A Better Life for All promise of 94 and Obama's Yes We Can promise when he took office?
No, I think that there's a fundamental difference. The ANC's Better Life for All would always have been realized because we came off such an enormously low base, such a high base of deprivation that people didn't even have water, people didn't even have electricity, people didn't even have access to schools and to clinics and so forth. So even if you had the worst ANC performance and it simply put a clinic in place or a school in place or a tap in place, you would always have defined already success in the quest for a better life. I think the United States, Obama faced the opposite problem, that you've had this false prosperity based on the idea that every individual can have 2 cars, can have a house, can have access to universities, and can pay for medical care. And now they've been mired in recession since 2007, and the promise of an ever-increasing but unsustainable better life is imploding. And so suddenly, the black president has to carry the can for an erosion of a ridiculously high inflated lifestyle. And that's the reaction to Obama and his attempts then to create a social healthcare system rather than a privatized one meets with massive opposition from the moneyed classes. So I think that for the foreseeable future, every ANC president can only preside over an ascending pace of delivery because of the low pace of delivery that we've had before, whereas for the foreseeable future, a United States president has to ease the citizens of the US to a more sustainable living level, which will be lower than the years of false prosperity that I think that they have been going through.
If one reflects on Obama's presidency, that there's a sense that he failed, or in achieving what he set out to do?
I think that there is a sense that he has achieved significant things for those who have been otherized, Hispanics, Muslims, blacks. Just the refusal to use words like Islamic terrorism and to put those things together have had an enormously dignifying effect on the Muslims. Just the fact that he grieves with the victims of police violence who happen to be black, I think has created a sense of a spotlight on a disease that was raging silently and under the carpet. And just the fact that he, even though he presided over the most deportations for those who qualified from the Hispanic community to be US citizens, that he has been able to give them a semblance of dignity is enormous. I think healthcare will certainly go down as a success, although I think he's compromised the guts out of the healthcare system. I think the fact that he promised to withdraw the US from wars, I think what is actually presided over is not US withdrawal from wars, but the changing nature of the wars, the technologizing of wars, the move from manned aircraft to unmanned aircraft, the move from boots on the ground from the Bush era to regionally aligned forces, that you now make the locals do the fighting and you give the commands. And so I think that it's a mixed record. I think that there is an understanding that unlike any other president, never mind the hostilities between a Republican Congress and a Democratic White House, he has been stymied. He has been tripped up far more often and far more deliberately. In the years that I've been there, the United States has not passed a budget and have had to borrow its way out of trouble. And that's the difficulties that comes there. But I think that the President Obama will certainly also wonder more loudly if he was always onto a hiding for nothing. Should he have been more assertive? Was he correct to think that he can seduce his way into the hearts of a right-wing Republican base, that he can seduce his way into the hearts of white America? And maybe he spent too much time being sensitive to winning their favor rather than advocating for that which he knew he should have advocated for.
So there are some people who have the same criticism of Nelson Mandela.
I think that I've thought a lot watching more dispassionately the headlines from South Africa and the EFF and so forth. And very crudely, my assessment is that the key criticism about whether Nelson Mandela sold out or whether he was too soft and so forth, there are two major sources of that criticism. The one is from those who have held those views essentially before Kempton Park and have now gathered evidence over the last 20 years to say we were right then. The second source of that criticism essentially comes from those who were unborn or unconscious at the time of that and have their aspirations defined by what they see in the world and not what existed prior to it. There are, of course, a good body of people who were with it and have now said, maybe we should have tweaked it here, maybe we should have asked for more. But I think if I look, and I have sat intimately with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, I have spent quite a bit of time with President Morsi and his government and so forth. And my frustration with Morsi was that he did not heed my advice that your first priority is to ward off counter-revolution, to defuse the army, to win over the police, to take the elite and to give them a stake in society. And Morsi lasted only 1 year. I think hindsight is such an exact science that we can now look back and say, because it was so easy, maybe Nelson Mandela did not have the challenges of counter-revolution to think through. But I would argue that given the fact that unlike Morsi, who had an Egyptian army, we had a white army. Unlike Morsi, who had an Egyptian police, we had a white police force. Unlike Morsi, who had an Egyptian elite, business class, we had a white elite and white business class. If counter-revolution could happen so easily in Egypt, a color-coded counter-revolution where all might, financial and military, were sitting with a specific color group in our country, I think we were more exposed. And so I wouldn't be too hard on Nelson Mandela. I would say maybe what we need to thank him for is the fact that in an era of coup d'etats, we warded off ours and even seduced a modicum. What has gone wrong in South Africa is that the patience of the poor, black communities, have not been rewarded with the generosity from the rich, essentially white communities. And maybe what we should take responsibility for is that we did not hold their feet to the fire to fulfill their side of the bargain, because we certainly fulfilled our side of the bargain. And so that is really, for me, just from a distance, the disjuncture I see in South Africa.
Is the world is becoming more right-wing? If one looks at the Brexit outcome, for instance.
I think the world is becoming polarized between an ultra-right phenomenon and an ultra-left phenomenon. And they are reactions to each other. I think that if you look at Donald Trump, you can't look at Donald Trump without looking at Bernie Sanders. Because on the one side, there is this visceral racism. There is this visceral intolerance. There is this visceral idea that a black president has taken our country away from us, and that we are being overrun by the other, whether Hispanic, black, or Muslim. And Donald Trump has not been held to the usual standard of leadership. What's your policy? What's the problem statement in the USA? What are your prescriptions to get out of it? What are your plans? He's been able to get away with just pressing the hot buttons of bigotry in the United States, and with a vague promise of making America great again, which could easily be making America white again. And so in a very real sense, that is a global phenomenon, because we live in an era where money, goods, capital, technology flows in an instant. But the moment people display the same mobility, we don't know what to do with them. We otherize them, we demonize them, and we marginalize them. And so in a sense, the choice before the West, Europe, and North America is, if you want all the mobility of technology, all the mobility of capital, all the mobility of goods from across the world, you can't shut the door on the mobility of people. That's what the fundamental challenge is in the world today, that people want to pick and choose the mobilities they like and close the doors on the mobilities they don't like, but that is not an option. And that if particularly you have destabilized a part of the world, you have created political vacuums, you've created the breeding ground for extremisms and fundamentalisms and continued conflicts, you don't have the moral authority to shut the doors of immigration. And that's what the white Western world has come to grips with. That's what they can't come to grips with. And that is where the prophets like Trump, like the Scandinavians ones, like Marine Le Pen, and all of them, what they are trying to stop the flow of history and to clean the hands of their complicity in the vacuums that have created the extremists, and the extremists that have created the refugees. And so that really is it. But what's encouraging is that there is a smaller reaction that I've seen Jeremy Corbyn getting elected and Bernie Sanders doing well. And so these are young people coming up and saying the world can be different, and that we can live inclusively and we can coexist. And so that's the encouraging sign. And so we mustn't choose the side of the pendulum that most fascinates us or most horrifies us. We've got to look at it and then decide what is the middle between them. How can we construct a middle? Because the hollowing out of the center in the world is the dangerous phenomenon that we are seeing moves towards the extremes, and the hollowing out of a middle ground that is well thought through, that can present policy prescriptions, and a middle ground from the South African experience that has to be militant. People need to see you fighting for what is good. And the problem with the middle ground is that we've become passive. We've abdicated our responsibility. We've lost our militant voices. We've gone respectable.
But people would say that the EFF is doing that at the moment.
I would say that when people ask me my analysis of the Muslim world, for example, I say that the Muslim world is a triangular conundrum. At its apex are the restless people who need relief. At the base are the terrible twins, the unsustainable dictatorships and undemocratic governments, and on the other side of it is the undesirable, the extremists. I was once asked, where do I place the EFF, for example, in that triangular conundrum, and I think they're part of the restless. I think that they articulate a grievance, they articulate an aspiration, they articulate a desire for more militant equality and so forth, but between their rhetoric and their methodologies, they forfeit sometimes the credentials to prescribe a way out of trouble, because they have articulated a need, but between the diagnosis and the prescription, they have missed the boat. And so what we need to do is to construct a global middle ground, national middle grounds that can speak with an authenticity and can speak with a militancy that can recapture the imagination of the disaffected, that can put the undesirable, defeat the undesirable extremists, and can put to the sword the unsustainable demagogues and dictators.
So, if one looks at the political systems generally, our political systems haven't really changed and haven't really kind of kept touch with, for instance, a world in where we have social media and where we have, like you say, this restless generation. And do you think it's possible within, say, current political systems to actually accommodate the people who are restless?
I think that we have to admire and slog away at making the democratic process work. But some of us are beginning to see the limitations of it. The United States is caught up in a simple two-party system that you either get Trump or you get Clinton, and you end up having to choose the lesser of two evils, because often Secretary Clinton is just another walk on some of the key issues of the world, and that has created momentum for Bernie Sanders. I think what we would need to do is to think through whether we need to add the richness of the current mobility that people have to the democratic experience. I think if you look at the way in which Jeremy Corbyn swept to the leadership of the Labour Party, it was a lot of loosely affiliated people who decided for the moment to be Labour, and then paid their subscriptions and used their votes to get him in. But the parliamentary system in Britain can't accommodate a kind of candidate from the outside into it, and that's why there's a parliamentary revolt to undo the kind of innate democracy of a socially media-driven generation. So what we need, something a little bit more than tweaking of the democratic system, is to create sites of democratic expression that don't conform to parties, parliaments, and all of those kind of things, but give everyone a stake in a particular society. And I think the ANC's inability to manage a Julius Malema after giving him the power to determine the presidency of this country. They gave him the power to determine the presidency of the country, and then when they called upon him to become respectable, they found that there wasn't a respectable bone in him. And so the only recourse was to exercise discipline over him and to send him outside to mobilize the masses. Now, between all of that, we need to define a new matrix that allows for democratic expression and allows the eccentricities that are loosened up in this mobile era that we live in. We should not be afraid of eccentricities. We should find channels for eccentricities. Like the anti-apartheid movement found ways to manage the unique eccentricities and contributions of a diversity of people and channel it all into a single set of objectives. I think we are now trapped in South Africa and globally in the prescribed channels. And when you're not able to navigate those channels, we don't know what to do with you. And
What are some of your highlights during that term?
I think that I had two wonderful opportunities. One exhilarating, the other one unfortunate, while I was ambassador of South Africa in Washington. The exhilarating one was that I wasn't an ambassador under George W. Bush, that I was ambassador entirely under Barack Obama. And so that gave me a disproportionate voice in the United States to the extent that I could even be invited to think tank meetings that would decide foreign policy, for example, of the second term of Obama. So that was exhilarating. What was unfortunate was that it coincided with the final years of Nelson Mandela and this great anxiety that I encountered when I arrived there, because people had seen Nelson Mandela at the closure of the most spectacularly successful soccer World Cup, and they saw this man sit on the back of a golf cart, and they realized that he's mortal. And I arrived there at the moment when people wondered, is something of our soul going to be leaving with him? And so I used that opportunity to create outpouring opportunities for people. We immediately started to say, at the spot where the first civil rights anti-apartheid activists were arrested outside the embassy, we are going to place Nelson Mandela's statue. And we worked towards that. But the process to it was more important. I was able to regather a lot of the anti-apartheid actors, activists, movements, and so forth into single venues. We were able to say thank you in a way in which our country forgot to say thank you when we were so busy, necessarily, with constructing our own future, that we forgot to say thank you to them. And we had the Nelson Mandela Awards that went to the senators and the congressmen who defeated Ronald Reagan when he didn't want to pass the sanctions laws, that we were able to go to the people who were arrested, people who spent time in jail, people who sat in Chase Manhattan, the university students who today are your kind of fund managers, and so forth, but who cut their political teeth on South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle, and gather them all together and build the momentum. When the ANC turned 100 in 2012, we kicked off a year-long celebrations with 4 festivals. It was an arts festival in which emerging artists sent their work to Washington and to the USA. It was a film festival in which L.B. Sachs's film took it by storm, and all the other ones came. It was a music festival which we played all the wonderful music that gave us our vibrancy, and it was a festival of ideas where we just moved from city to city, debating, and I gave people, in a sense, permission to be critical, because I quoted a friend of mine's minimalist poem, Shabir Banubai, which simply reads, "Forget who you are to remember who you were." And that resonated, because it gave people permission to say, we are disappointed with where South Africa is going now. You are not giving us leadership. We look to you for leadership, and suddenly we now just have to defend your quirks and your aberrations, and so forth. And so So that was certain. And the day that we unveiled Nelson Mandela's statue, it was a day when the clouds just came in a hot, the rain stayed away, the sun didn't beat down on us. And it was a wonderful affirmation of what had happened. And a great day was when I went to San Francisco and gave them the award to the Longshoremen's Union that for 12 days refused to unload a ship because it contained South African goods. And when I went to the memorial service of the main organizer, that hall erupted because they felt that they were recognized for what they had done. And that really is what it's all about. Then I can speak about all the other nuts and bolts stuff, restoring investment, saving AGOA, getting cultural exchanges. But that's your job description. The passionate part is what you are able to do with your presence there at crucial moments.
And so part of your job description is to promote the country, to promote the positive image of the country. And so were there times when you found it difficult to do?
The most difficult time was Marikana, because here you had the coalition of black trade unions. They had mobilized the AFL-CIO behind the anti-apartheid struggle. They were the people who organized the 12-week stoppage in San Francisco. And they were horrified that in democratic South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, that 35 people could be shot to death. And they convened a meeting of Trans-Africa, of all the greats of the anti-apartheid struggle, and they penned a most devastating letter. If that letter ever saw the light of day, it would be the greatest vote of no confidence in democratic South Africa that would ever come from the people who stood in the trenches for our freedom. They had the courtesy, out of respect for me, to come as a delegation and to say, we want to read you this letter that we are going to send to your president, and then we are going to release it to the media. I read that letter and I thought, whatever the aberrations in South Africa, we can't afford this to be the epitaph, to be written on our gravestone. And I said to them, you know what I'll do? I don't want you to say this in a letter. The South African Embassy will organize in the Central Metropolitan Church a memorial service for the victims of the Marikana massacre. All of you can say exactly what you want for as long as you want that night, and I won't even reply to defend it, but I see this as an important one. You have contributed to our freedom. You have earned the right to say what you want. And I tell you, that night we sat, people were mourning the loss of innocence in South Africa. That was what it came down to. But by that time, they had tempered their language. Jonathan Butler came to sing Heal Our Land. Danny came to drum his way into their hearts and to express our sorrow. Danny Peterson. Priests who had come from New York, where they had preached against apartheid, now came to speak to us in the language, in a spiritual language, and so forth. And so there are ways of representing your country in tragic moments. You can do the kind of perfunctory thing, issue the statement, justifying it, swear allegiance, make as if nothing's gone wrong, the problem was all the workers and so forth, or you can simply be honest. And so out of that, I developed my own definition of diplomacy. I've said diplomacy is the art of telling the truth gently and intelligently. But you've got to tell the truth.
So after your term ended as ambassador, you decided to stay to be at Georgetown?
I came back.
Okay.
I came back, and the minister was kind enough to phone me to say that they don't have an immediate post for me. They only have one that frees up much later and so forth. And I, for the first time, sat for 3 months in Cape Town, not knowing what to do when I get up in the morning. But I had no expectations. The ANC did not owe me anything. The government did not owe me anything. And then Secretary Albright, former Secretary of State, she phoned me. And she said, has your government found anything useful for you to do? And I said, not yet. And she said, well, in a month's time, if they haven't yet, I'm phoning you again. And then I'll find something useful for you to do. And a month later, she was true to her word. Almost exactly, she phoned and she said, we have never had an ambassador in Washington able to tell us a piercing truth, but without ever appearing as if you have a personal hatred for us. And that's what you've got to do with the remaining superpower in the world. How can you speak truth to them, but not alienate yourself so much from them that they cease to listen? And then she offered me the Aspen Institute, other think tanks that she's busy with, but I found it far more palatable and comfortable to choose the option of Georgetown University. Another offer came from the Fletcher School at Tufts University in Boston. I thought that for my son's education, we know Washington and he's at a school there. And so and 3 days later, the president of Georgetown University, our vice chancellor equivalent, he called and he said, we want you to come. I said, let me wait another month and see whether my government has, or my party has any deployment for me, and nothing came. And that's when I signed a 15-month contract, and alhamdulillah, 15 months later, I have completed an editing of a book, and am one chapter away from completion of a fully expanded, written up version of the 12 most crucial speeches I've made on the Muslim world. And the reason that I have chosen over the last while to focus on the Muslim world is because it is the most troubled part of the world. No one can argue that if you want to bring peace to the world, you've got to bring peace to the Muslim soul. Because for the last 70 years, Muslims have been central to the major conflicts of the world. And when you have the kind of background where you've grown up in the anti-apartheid struggle, you've been part of its the transition from apartheid to democracy, and you have served in the formative governments of a new South Africa, how do you apply those experiences onto the other part of your identity, where you are a Muslim and you despair about the devastation in the name of Islam? You've got to connect those two dots. And I thought that because I was also a fairly conscious Muslim, I'm not saying conscientious, I'm saying conscious Muslim, I have a duty to the world to intervene in the processes of that community that carries a part of my identity. And so the one book is called Reimagining Islam, Between Dogma and Fury. And the other one is Living Where We Don't Make the Rules, a manual for Muslim minorities, how to coexist, etc., etc. So that's really what I have been doing there. And I have till the end of December to complete these works.
And then what happens after that?
Well, you know, since
Back
the
in South
last,
Africa or in the US?
the last career decision I made was in 1980 in Matric, when I had to choose what I want to do, and I chose to be a teacher. And I chose to teach at Spine Road in Mitchell's Plain, but that was short-lived when the state of emergency came. We were all in prison. And I got a telegram from the Reverend Alan Hendrickse to say your services as a teacher are no longer required. And that was the last decision I made about a career. Every other one has either been accidental or has been driven by forces outside of me. And maybe I'll give it another try and see what happens. But certainly, I think that I have a base from which to work. It's the World for All Foundation. It has taken me into meetings with the Syrian opposition and helping them to prepare a negotiating strategy. It's taken me into the pre-coup Morsi government and the post-coup Ikhwan, and really trying to keep the Muslim Brotherhood onto a path of resistance, but using the capacity for militant non-violence, because it would be foolish for them to try and match Sisi militarily. In Egypt, I've been working with the Bahrainis to try and see whether a formula for Shia-Sunni coexistence can happen. I've even been to Haiti to advise parties about a manifesto so that they get away from the personality-driven, the Padron syndrome of politics that have bedeviled Haiti. Haiti is too important for us to let it go. I've been working in Boston, and you'd be quite interested to know, the mayor of Boston, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter campaign, wanted to head off some of that. And I introduced them to the notion of one city, many cultures, that unless you have that kind of approach to things, the kind of home for all approach to things, you will not succeed. And so that I'm now going to Seattle to do a similar thing there, to head off those kind of issues. And so all in all, I think that it's been there'll always be work in the World for All Foundation. I don't need to be in government, but I certainly think that I need South Africa to be on even keel, because when the world is so hungry for a positive role model, a national success, outstanding leadership, and a movement that has endured for over 100 years, we can't allow the movement, the leadership, or anything to go into disrepair, because it affects the credibility and the authenticity with which we speak to the world. And increasingly, I have found people beginning to say, yeah, but you speak so much of South Africa, but look what's happening there, look what's happening there. Last week, your president did this, last week, this thing happened. And so it erodes the moral authority of South Africa in the world, and it gives your lesser leaders a chance to get off the hook. Because while we were speaking with the clarity of a Mandela, it held every African president to a high moral standard. Now they say, no, you have feet of clay. Why should we follow you? You couldn't sustain it. And that's the reason. And that's what gave me the moral authority to be able to speak passionately in the USA about a post-militarism approach to solving problems. Now they're saying, no, why should we listen to you? You're a country driven by conspiracy theories. So that's that.
So are you in a happier space now that you are no longer active in South African politics?
I've lost,
particularly Western politics.
I've lost 20 kilos. My blood sugar is under control. My blood pressure is normal. My wife loves me again. I've seen my children in their formative years, and the stress has reduced enormously. And so I'm in a very happy space. But I think that as all people who, whether we've given a drop of sweat or one tear or not even a drop of blood to the struggle, we can never feel satisfied when our creation is not perfect. And so that restlessness stays with me. And that's the ambiguity in my life. I know that I am successfully doing what I love doing, but something continues to gnaw at your soul. And I've just got to resolve that.
And so how closely do you follow Western Cape politics?
Well, now in the era of social media, when I wake up early in the morning, I go to my Media 24 app. On a Friday, I go to my Mail and Guardian app. I get the wake-up call from the Daily Maverick and read what your optimism levels are like, and so forth. So I keep up, but it is now more dispassionately. I am, I can look at things without having an interest in them. I'm interested, but I don't have an interest. And that keeps me sufficiently worried, but not unduly anxious.
Over the years since I've met you in the early 80s, you've always kind of had almost like two sides to your personality, your political side, your spiritual, religious side, which in fact I like a lot more than the political side. And I mean, have you found it difficult to reconcile the two over the years?
No, I've never really. I think the most uncomfortable period was when I was trapped in a political position and I had to step beyond my ethical bounds to deal with the exigencies of politics. And so by the time the ANC decided to recall me as Premier, it came more as a relief than as a moment of disappointment or anger in my life.
Can you maybe be specific about that? I mean, what did you have to do that made you feel uncomfortable?
No, I think that the internal battles in the ANC, I've got no worries about the brown envelope stuff because my conscience is completely clear. I cultivated media relations. Otherwise, we'd never have had a look in the main newspapers of the Cape Town, but I've never had to pay for them. So that is not what is a problem for me, and I'm vindicated by the fact that the DA has made 6 forensic investigations and the ANC has investigated it, and the person who made the allegation has given me a signed confession about how much he was paid for it. But and I don't even feel the compulsion to go and leak that document and so forth, because there was a period when he was good. And there's a period in which he fell into personal psychosocial difficulties. And I'm not going to destroy him even further by making those kind of things known. But I think that the factional battles, I think within the ANC, is not something that I'm proud of. Having to defend yourself by going on the offensive on other people and so forth, it was always an act of exertion rather than something that came naturally from my soul. And so for me, it was the Afrikaans word is better, a verlossing. It allowed me to just lose some stuff. And so I've learned from Lot's wife, don't look back. Don't yearn for things that are past. And then I've also learned from Lazarus in the Bible, when you're given a second life, grasp it. Don't be the slave of your previous one.
So do you think the ANC in the province is in a better or worse state than when you left it?
Look, I could try to be modest and say, no, it's not really, it's fine. But look, objectively speaking, it is in a worse state. In 2008, when the Markino polls were done on approval ratings for premiers across the country, I was at about 60-62%. When the Markino poll said what was the approval rating for the ANC government in the Western Cape, it was at 53%. I mean, it's sad that the ANC could muster only 30%, below what we even got in '94. That we're fighting for our life now, that we are caught up again in the identity politics that we thought we left behind out of the bitterness of the '94 election campaign, that we are mired in controversy, allegations of corruption, and allegations of just unethical behavior. And so I'm still being modest when I say I don't think it is in a better position. Whether I would have made a difference is another matter.
And so what do you realistically think of the NC's chances in the municipal elections?
Look, in 94 we realized that we were busy with a 10-year project. That anyone who wants instant results won't get it. And you may remember that we started a rebuilding process from 1994 that only realized victory in 2004. So our timescale was right. I think that it started with 5 years of internal reform within the ANC, making the ANC non-racial, making the ANC wholesome, making the ANC a visionary organization again in the Western Cape that appealed to everyone. That's where the Home for All vision was born. And it took us to about 99 to reform the ANC. And we got the first reward for that when we became the biggest party but not big enough to govern in the 99 election. The full reward came by 2004 when we were now in a position to govern, because now we were able to say as an ANC that our internal coherence must now translate into an external messaging. And that's where we were able to go out and campaign on the basis of making the ANC a home for all, underpinning a unified vision with an economic strategy called the Cape that we grow and the Cape that we share, Ikapa Elishlumayo, and so forth. And those were really the wonderful things that I think, and the electorate rewarded us by electing us to government. And then the devil broke loose, because now people who had been patiently part of building up that, suddenly felt that the victory was permanent, that we can now be reckless again, that the reserve that we've had for 10 years in rebuilding the ANC, we can now let loose. And the politics of envy started to replace the politics of development. And so what's the time frame? I think we must at least set ourselves another 10-year timetable from this election. And we must do the hard yards again. We can shorten the learning curve, but we've got to, there are no shortcuts. You cannot get the confidence of the province if you can't build unity in the ANC. You can't project an image of non-racialism if you are fragmenting racially within the ANC. You can't hold out an optimistic, hopeful vision for the public if everything inside is about shortcuts and ethical compromise. And therefore, I think that the hard yards must be done. Then you've got to present it to the public, and then you've got to test it with the public. And if you're lucky, they will give you the chance. But for me, my experience tells me it's 10 years.
And what do you think, the impact of national politics has on the Western Cape and on municipal politics specifically?
I think the point is that if you are spending an election campaign defending, you're never getting the opportunity to advance. If you're in a defensive trench, you are not able to move forward. And that really is the sense that I get when I go to mosques and so forth. The first 10 minutes I have to explain, wat het dan verkeerd gegaan? What went wrong? And any activist who has to go and canvass door to door, it's fear-inspiring to knock on a door and to only meet skepticism. And so the point is that no general sends your troops into battle only to defend. It can get you, as Alistair Coetzee discovered at the Stormers, it can get you into the playoffs but can never win you a trophy. And so when you're defending a person, when you're defending an issue, when you're defending a series of issues, that's not the way to go forward. you can survive, because there will always be a core demographic base whose memory of apartheid is so sharp that anything is better than that. But on the other hand, there will be people who, particularly minorities, will take flight. And it's not that you must pander to minorities. Nelson Mandela never pandered to the colored community. He always understood that the non-racial project depends on whether you can get the colored and the Indian and the other minority communities to support the ANC and be behind the government. When you retreat into your base, it's sufficient to win elections. But is the non-racial vision that we've always had, that has distinguished the ANC from any other party, is that still intact? Can we be proud of a victory that is at the expense of a principle? And that really is the challenge of the Western Cape and the country.
And so is there any chance of you coming back to play a more active role politically?
Look, I will always be a political
You're still
animal.
a member of the ANC.
I'm still a member of the ANC, although I must check on my card. I haven't swiped it in the last 2 years, so it may have expired. But I don't need the card. I mean, this ANC has given me things that a lighty from the Cape Flats should never have the audacity to have dreamt of. I mean, how do you become Premier? How do you become Minister of Health in the Western Cape? How do you sit in the NEC with Nelson Mandela? I mean, it's audacious to think that that is just for you. So there will always be something that I will have to be grateful for the ANC. But because of all of those experiences, I also have the obligation to say things in the gentlest, most intelligent ways when I see things are wrong. I can't be the victim of my rage. That's why I didn't join COPE. That's why I didn't join any other party, because I knew that in the ANC what goes around comes around. And maybe I have this silly optimism that the self-reforming instinct in the ANC will kick in. But for it to kick in, good people must be there or thereabouts. And so I'm hoping in my silly optimism that if I'm there and thereabouts, that the moment will come when we will have enough synergy to be able to get the movement back on track and to make it a global leader in a world that I think is polarizing between the extreme right and the extreme left. Because the ANC historically has found that comfortable anchor in the center. And so we need to do it not just because of what's going down now, but for what the world needs. And so I'm a political animal. I see myself as an ambassador of the finest values of the ANC and the finest example of this country. I can play my role globally, but my role globally requires that I also keep a watching brief here so that the role model isn't messed up. And I don't speak from the emptiness of my mind when I speak serious stuff to the Syrians, to the Egyptians, to the Tunisians, to the Yemenis, to the people in Haiti, to the mayor of Boston, to the people of Seattle, and so forth.
And that you do through your Home for All Fund.
World for All.
World for
Home for All may have become a swear word.
I remember us sitting in town somewhere
Oh, absolutely.
and talking about establishing the foundation.
I didn't know
ago.
if I could compromise you, but you were part of establishing that vision of how do we accelerate and magnify what had worked successfully in the Western Cape, because my idea of the Home for All, I may have bastardized it, but my idea of the Home for All came out of being absolutely inspired by your editorship and the One City, Many Cultures. That's when I knew that we could capture the imagination of the people of the Western Cape. But that's what I've taken and said, we can capture the imagination of the global community with this vision.
And so is there any attempt to capture the imagination of the local community with your World for All Foundation?
Look, I think that the World for All Foundation is established legally in Cape Town and is also established in the USA. So it has two legal persona. my feeling is that I want to set up base in Cape Town, and if it has a knock-on effect, I'm doing a lecture on extremism at UCT in August. I will speak with some Palestinians when they come down to Cape Town, etc. But I think that I want to have a kind of oblique impact on the Western Cape without upsetting or threatening the powers that be, because then the knives come out again when some people think that just Ramache Eitnek, that you are over assertive. So I want to keep my enemies at bay by not threatening them, because otherwise I get back into the vicious cycle of having to defend myself and having to step outside of your preferred ethical mode and all of those kind of things. But I think that South Africa is far more important to the world than it can imagine.
Yeah, thank you for, taking out time on a busy Sunday morning.
No, thank you very much. It's an
Okay.
absolute honor to be on the Ryland Fisher Show. And
Thank you.
I wish you all the best in taking off. And I think that there is a need for intelligent debate, because I think that that is the casualty of the current moment.